Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Meir Soloveichik, Rabbi of Shearith Israel. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you to our magnificent sanctuary and to the oldest Jewish community in America, which is marking this year our year of years, 365 years of Jews in America. I'm delighted to note the presence and to welcome our Parnas, our president, Louis Solomon, and to thank our executive director, my colleague, Barbara Rice, for our help in putting together this evening's event. I want to welcome Rob Schwartz of the Hidden Light Institute, on whose board I'm privileged to serve, and Herzi Makov of the Menachem Begin Heritage Center, which has been such a source of an inspiration to me. Hidden Light and the Begin Heritage Center are working on putting together a documentary about my hero and the subject of this evening, Menachem Begin. You will be hearing about Begin from our distinguished guest, Senator Joseph Lieberman. I'm so delighted to welcome Senator and Mrs. Lieberman, whose family's friendship has been such a blessing to Lisa and myself as well. I want to thank Rachel Greenberg from Hidden Light for all her hard work for tonight's event. And now I'd like to call on Rob and Herzi for a brief presentation before the evening's remarks.
How was that? Good? It's wonderful.
Okay, now.
Very good, Rabbi. Keep up the good work. I want to thank all of you for being here tonight. Today's a special day. I started this morning with the Tikva Institute and the Jewish Book Review, celebrating Jewish authors and Jewish books. Very appropriate, because Menachem Begin loved reading, loved books, just loved the experience, and he was a mighty person with the word and with the pen, and in fact wrote 2 wonderful books, and I will come to that soon. It's wonderful to end the day at this great synagogue that the rabbi talked about with such a great history, and we are here to make a presentation to 2 great Jewish leaders, Joe Lieberman, my former boss, and Rabbi Soloveichik. They are powerful supporters of our effort to create this documentary about Menachem Begin. And briefly, I just want to say it started 2 years ago where I discovered that both Joe and I read prime ministers, finished it about the same time, discovered over a lovely kosher dinner in Riverdale with Hadassah, Joe, my wife Vicky, and I, that we both fell in love with Begin. And I said to him, I've decided to do something. I hope you don't think I'm a Meshuggah. And Joe, with his wry sense of humor, said, well, tell me what you want to do, and I'll tell you if I think you're a Meshuggah. And I said, I'm going to make an award-winning documentary about his life. And he said very seriously, I don't think so at all. And the rest is history. We have a formal partnership with the Begin Center. And people have asked us, why are we doing this? And the answer is, why not? Why not tell the story of a man small in stature, but large against the canvas of Jewish and Israeli history? In the face of virulent, increasing anti-Semitism, why not tell the story about a man when he was young witnessing Jews being humiliated, and then as an adult getting firsthand accounts of how the village was led by his father to a river singing Hatikva, and then were machine gunned to death? That should be unacceptable to all of us in this sanctuary. And so we have come together to create an award-winning documentary. I mentioned to all of you that he loved books. He wrote a book called The Revolt. And a wonderful man by the name of Hart Haston, and I would remiss not to recognize his son, Bernard, who is the chairman of our board. Bernard, if you could stand up, please. Hart Haston, when oldest living friend of Menachem Begin, wanted to recognize when Prime Minister Begin was reelected, paid to have the Revolt reprinted in a very handsome way, a limited edition. And Begin spent about 4 months signing each book. I'm going to now step aside to Herzi Makov.
Good evening. As Rob just said, I got up in order to make the presentation, but I must begin with the fact that I'm really moved and overwhelmed by the fact that such Kehilat Kodesh, and maybe it's not by chance that it's the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue that honor Menachem Begin. Because, you know, until now, the main support to Begin in Israel was the Sephardic community. So here in the States, we are starting also with this branch, with this segment of the population. And I'm overwhelmed because I believe that it's the largest gathering of Jews in honor of Menachem Begin since he passed away. And I don't know if I'm allowed, Rabbi, to say Shechayanu without Shem Melchut. So Shechayanu v'ikimanu v'giyanu lazman hazeh. We would like to present The Revolt, the books that Begin wrote about the periods that he described as the most important part of his life. More than being a prime minister, more being a prime minister who made peace with Egypt, more than prime minister that ordered the bombing of the nuclear reactor in Iraq. And that book is an inspiration to many, including Rabbi Meir Soloveichik, which in our first meeting told me that after reading that book during his high school time, he overcome the fact that the beginning of the relationship between the Soloveichik family and the Begin family didn't start in the right foot back in Brisk. And I don't know if you are going to mention it today, but Begin's father was the secretary of the community and the leader of the Zionist movement. And he wanted to make a yortzeit to Herzl after he died. And Reb Chaim, who wasn't the greatest Zionist, I mean, he was the greatest great rabbi, but not the greatest Zionist, forbid it. So Begin's father broke the lock of the synagogue, arranged the yortzeit, changed the lock, and brought back the key, the new key, to Reb Chaim of Brisk. So Rabbi Soloveichik had to overcome that tradition of his family by that book that we are now proudly want to give him.
So we ask you both to come up. We're honored to present this to both of you.
I just want to say to Senator Joe Lieberman, first we would like to express our appreciation for the support and the friendship that you give this project from day one, as Rob described, to appreciate your leadership, which is in many ways are following the footsteps of Menachem Begin, and also to thank you for, if you don't mind, your greatest contribution to the Begin Center by sending your granddaughter to serve in Shearith Leumi in our center in the last year.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks, sir.
I'll take this. Senator Joseph Lieberman.
Thanks, Rabbi, for that extraordinary introduction. I was once at an event in Washington where Henry Kissinger was the main speaker, and the chairman of the event said, if there's anybody in the world who doesn't need an introduction, it's Henry Kissinger, so I give you Henry Kissinger. Kissinger came up and said, you know, I suppose I don't need an introduction, but I like a good introduction. Anyway, thanks for your kind words. I'm glad to be here to balance Rabbi Soloveichik, because as far as I know, there's no previous generation of the Lieberman family that had any conflict with the Begin family. It's really a remarkable story, and but eventually the Soloveichik family got it right. And Rabbi Soli is just a gift to Judaism, to New York. It was my honor to participate in his installation as rabbi of this historic congregation 5 years ago. And as far as I know, the warranty is still good, and the statute of limitations has not passed, and I'm very proud to have participated in that, and I know the members of the congregation are grateful for it. I want to thank Herzi Meko for his kind words, for the copy of the Revolt with Begin's signature. Amazing. Somebody, when I was leaving Washington in 2012, they held a dinner for me at the Israeli embassy, which was very nice, and then Ambassador Michael Oren presented me with a chumash, which he said was autographed by the author. I'm still looking for the autograph. Anyway, but I know who the author was. I want to thank Rob Schwartz. Rob and I are friends from New Haven, Connecticut. We're landsmen. He worked for me over a period of years with great commitment and loyalty and ability. We did have that dinner. He told me about this project. The truth is, it is in Yiddish a bissel meshuga, just a little bit crazy, but it's people who are a little bit crazy who make things different. I mean, one might easily have said that Menachem Begin of blessed memory was a little bit meshuga, but look at what he and his generation of the founders made possible. So I'm very grateful, proud to be here to pay tribute to Begin, to share a few thoughts about him, and also to support the raising of adequate money to make this documentary about Menachem Begin. And I'll really come back to that very briefly at the end. Incidentally, before I go further, I want to say how happy I am and proud to be here with my wife, Hadassah Freilich Lieberman. Okay, I really want to start with this statement. I believe that we may be the most lucky, blessed generation of Jews in Jewish history. There are some times, certainly when the Beit Mikdash was up, when maybe they would give a little competition to that. But notwithstanding some of the troubles of today, which we all know about, when you think about it, what a time that we're lucky enough to be alive in as Jews for two main reasons. The first, obviously, is after almost 2,000 years, the reestablishment of the Jewish state of Israel. Really a miracle. And then the second is the existence of the United States of America, in many ways founded on the same principles, really very Jewish principles, as Rabbi Soli has so eloquently spoken of so often. But more specifically, for us as Jews, there has never been a place in our history outside of Israel where we have had as much freedom, opportunity, respect, success, influence as in the United States of America. And I start there because I want to make the point that most of us who love both of these countries believe that each was at least divinely inspired in its creation. You can certainly see it in the founding documents of both countries and in the statements at the time of founding by the heroes who founded both countries. It was at least divinely inspired, something that God's hand was in it more directly. But we also know, in words that for me, when I was a young man, from President Kennedy's inaugural address, were catalytic, inspiring, which was that we ask God's blessings on our work, but here on earth we know that God's work must truly be our own. And that idea resonated with me because I had had something of a Torah education growing up in Stamford, Connecticut, and some of my great heroes carried out that fundamental principle which runs through Torah and Tanakh. I mean, it begins with Avram Avinu, Abraham, our father, who was so devoted to the principle of monotheism that he upset the idols in his father's shop. He left his family. He swore loyalty to God and went to what eventually became the land of Israel. To me, one of the great moments of this idea is when the children of Israel, Bnei Israel, are at the Red Sea, and I will do a quick personal paraphrasing, but Pharaoh's armies are approaching, and the Israelis panic. And Moses begins to pray to God, and God essentially, as I read it, says, Moshe, it's not time for prayer, it's time for action. It's time for action based on faith that what I've said to you, which is that I would take you to the mountain and then to the Holy Land, you can trust in. And Moshe held a stick up, as we all know. Nothing happened until Nachshon ben Amidav, a leader of the tribe of Judah, walked into the water up until his mouth, almost drowning, and then the waters separated. An act of faith and leadership to bring about a change. The final one I love to quote is from Megillat Esther, and it's only in part because my wife's name is Hadassah Esther. But remember that extraordinary moment where Esther has the courage to approach the king at risking her life to plead with him to save the Jewish people, and he does. And so too has it been with these two great countries that are really brought together in this beautiful building and live still in this extraordinary congregation, which is they were both founded by people who had the courage to dream and then the courage to act on those dreams at great risk to themselves. That was certainly true of the founding generation of Americans and those who fought the British Empire to secure the independence of this country. And of course, it was true of the modern generation of Zionists. I mean, for century after century, in prayers, tefillot, some of which remain in our Siddur, and they have a poignancy, Jews prayed for a return to the land of Israel. And then at the end of the 19th century, Herzl decided it was time to do something about it because he foresaw the cataclysm that was coming in Europe. And then a whole generation of leaders followed, Weizmann and Ben-Gurion and Jabotinsky. As Rabbi Sali said, Begin was raised in a Zionistic family. He was raised in a religious family, too, which actually made him somewhat unique among the founding generation of Israelis. But he was deeply influenced by Jabotinsky on one of Jabotinsky's tours of Europe to seek recruits to make Aliyah to go to Israel. He went to Israel and he became part of the extraordinary, struggle to secure independence and freedom for the state of Israel. He became the leader of the Irgun, the underground, and after the independence of the country, he went into the Knesset, and as you know, became the leader of the opposition to Mapai, to what became Labor, as the leader of his own party, Herut. He was 30 years in the opposition. And then, surprisingly, in the late 70s, was able to win the office of Prime Minister and became a remarkably successful leader. I must tell you that we are very close still in our generation to the founding generation of Zionists. So while we admire them greatly, again, Herzl, Ben-Gurion, Jabotinsky, Golda Meir, Begin, Weizmann, et cetera, Rabin, Peres, they seem very human to us, I think, sometimes, and we don't perhaps appreciate them enough. In my opinion, in the sweep of Jewish history, when we think about the miracle of the creation of Israel after the horrors of the Holocaust, their role in our time, providing for us this extraordinary miracle and reality of the state of Israel, is comparable to some of the leading figures in Torah and Tanakh. I think their contribution is that great, and certainly as great as the extraordinary leaders who had the principle and the courage to found America. I want to I could go on too long about Begin, but I want to share with you some lessons that I think Begin's life teaches us, and that I'm confident that the documentary that will be made about it will teach us and generations to follow. The first is the point that I originally made, which is that people can change history. In fact, without people acting with courage and determination, history will never change. There's a famous Margaret Mead comment, the anthropologist: never underestimate the capacity of a small group of citizens to change history. In fact, she said, it's the only way it has ever happened. Begin's life and the life of the others in that founding generation of Zionists prove that is so, and remind us that it can be so in our own lifetimes in ways that are both large and small. The second lesson really is persistence. I once ran for Congress and lost, and I received so many letters telling me about the lives of Lincoln and Churchill, that because they ran and lost and lost until they won. And I was actually quite comforted and inspired by those lessons from history, but one could say the same about Begin. I mean, look, he did a lifetime's work in the role that he played in creating and establishing the state of Israel. But then he took all this principle in him and devotion to the state and its future, his vision of the state, and took it into politics. And just think about it in the time horizon of most American politicians, or even Israeli politicians. 30 years in the opposition, and persistent. He developed a philosophy. He was a profoundly strong. One might say he was hawkish. He was hawkish, but stuck with it until he succeeded, and then he had a remarkable time, tremendously productive as Prime Minister. So he teaches us all to not give up And maybe that's a lesson to everybody raising money for this project. Keep going until you get it done. The other thing to say about him is that, and this really speaks to our time in American politics, really he always put the Israeli national interest first, the Jewish national interest first. He had very strong opinions. He wasn't in the opposition for 30 years because he had weak opinions. He had strong opinions. He had opinions about a greater Israel geographically, et cetera, et cetera. He got into a tremendous fight, really a fascinating kind of emotional fight when the Israeli government decided to accept reparations payments from Germany. As probably many of you know, he decried what he thought was a kind of act of forgiveness of the Germans, which was much too, in his opinion, premature. So he had very strong opinions, but and a fierce fighter, really called a terrorist during the time when he was leading the Irgun, living underground under difficult, very, very difficult circumstances, separated too often from his wife and children to whom he was so deeply devoted. And then I'll just say it briefly because most people know about it, this incredible incident on the Alta Lena when Irgun was bringing a boatload of volunteers and arms into Israel. And Ben-Gurion, who was by this time the head of the national government and the head of the, you might say, the Jewish agency, and the commander-in-chief, in a way, over the Haganah, ordered basically the Haganah troops there that if Begin did not vacate the boat and basically turn the arms over, that they should fire on the boat. They did. And lives were lost on the boat, but Begin ordered his troops, his Irgun people, not to fire back because he said he refused to be part of what anybody could interpret as a civil war among Jews ever, but certainly not so after the Shoah. The other case, he was a ferocious opponent of the government, happened to be Levi Eshkol when the Six-Day War occurred, but he immediately, and I tell the story too simply, but he went to Eshkol and said, it's time to form a unity government. The existence of the state is on the line. Politics doesn't matter anymore. I want everybody in Israel and our enemies to know that we are united. So he put the national interest first. Important lesson for people here in American politics and around the world. Secondly, another lesson, as strongly as his opinion was, he showed over his life that he had the ability to change when he thought it would serve Israel's interest. And to me, one of the most graphic, compelling examples of that, because he was so strong on defense, on the integrity of Israel, that at the moment when Anwar Sadat essentially initiated, although there was some prior work done, the trip to Jerusalem, Begin entered into the negotiations, greeted Sadat with honor, and went to Camp David, and the agreement followed, which has not been perfect, but really has created stability and security between Israel and Egypt, which remains the largest Arab country and the strongest on Israel's borders. And the final lesson is that he believed in, I don't know if I'd call it kiruv work, outreach work, but he was open to alliances. He was religious. He came here at one point during the Camp David negotiations, and I was struck by the fact that he went to visit the Lubavitcher Rebbe of blessed memory, Rabbi Menachem Begin. And it was very important in terms of not only seeking the Rebbe's advice and showing him respect, but in that sense also in helping to unify people back home in Israel. And he was, as far as I know, the first Israeli leader to extend his hand and take the hand of Christian evangelicals who were expressing support for Israel and looking for a way to overcome the centuries of distrust between Jews and Christians to create a bond that was based in Torah and had enormous and has since practical impact on the security of the state of Israel. He had a really remarkable history, and finally I would say, hard to remember for people in politics, he was humble. He had the courage, it's the old story about that the rabbis tell us that we have two pieces of paper, if you will, one in each pocket. One says, the world was created for you. There's nothing you can't do. And the other one, in the other pocket says, you're like a piece of sand on the beach. You're really just about nothing. And so Begin had enormous confidence to do the things he did, risk his life, fight for independence, take risks for the country and his party to serve the future of Israel. But he was also extremely humble. And I just tell you this story, which I was very moved by. Hadassah and I were in Israel with our family for this Pesach. And I went with one of our kids to Har Herzl, to Mount Herzl. And it's a remarkable site, and many of you have been there. Herzl is buried there, Jabotinsky. I mean, all the greats from the founding generation of Zionists, but also the great leaders of our time, Rabin, Peres, Golda, et cetera, et cetera. But Begin is not buried there. And why is he not buried there? He specifically asked to be buried on Har HaZeitim, the Mount of Olives, next to two of his fellow members of Irgun who fell in battle in fighting for the independence of the state of Israel. He's buried there with his wife and those two people who would otherwise, except for people who really follow the details of that battle, would not be known. And it's an act of humility, but I think it also says in some way, if I'm allowed to interpret without authority, that as Begin looked back at his life with all he did, that the thing he was proudest of was the role he played in fighting for and succeeding with his brothers and sisters in Irgun and Haganah in fighting for and succeeding creating the state of Israel. Mr. Chaim Oren told me a wonderful story about Begin, that Etzel, part of the Irgun, was marching right after the Alta Lane in a parade. They would have to march, a military parade, they'd have to march by Ben Gurion. And Begin ordered them to salute Ben Gurion as they went by him. And they protested. And he said, we have differences of opinion, but we are one country. He is the leader, and we will salute him. So, look, the lessons he teaches us are now ours and our children's and our grandchildren's to carry on. The state of Israel would not have been created without the courage of people like Menachem Begin, would not have been protected, sustained, and grown to the remarkable reality it is today. And I will say what sounds harsh, but I believe it, it will not be sustained unless succeeding generations of Jews and Christians, and hopefully one day Muslims, will stand together and fight for its existence. Now let me say a final word about why I think this film is so important. About a year ago, I spoke at a conference that AIPAC convened of about 200 college students from the Northeast and Midwest who are campus representatives of AIPAC. And we were talking about the problems of being Jewish on some of the campuses in the country. The BDS movement, yes, but they're trained to fight that. And a young woman got up and said the thing that bothers her most is of course BDS, but she can fight that, and there are those who will fight with her. She can't believe the number of Jewish students on campus, and she said it's at least half who want nothing to do with any of this. They don't care. So I said, why is that? Why do you think that is? And she said, I don't think they understand or know about Jewish history. I don't think they know there was a Holocaust, but honestly, they don't know anything about the Zionist movement. They don't know all that was done and the difficulties of it to create the State of Israel. They don't know about the Six-Day War, really. They don't know about the Yom Kippur War, and we have to find a way to teach them. And I can't think of a better way in the years ahead than for there to be a first-rate documentary about a principled and courageous Zionist named Menachem Begin that will be shown on college campuses throughout America. I hope you will help to make that happen. Thank you very, very much.
Before I begin, few expressions of gratitude. First, to Senator Lieberman for his wonderful words. It's such a delight to welcome you and Mrs. Lieberman back following the extraordinary privilege of having you here to participate in my installation. Thank you. To Rob and to Hertzie, I'm so grateful for the gift of an autographed copy of a book which, as Hertzie mentioned, I read in high school, and it changed my life forever. I do feel I should make a brief response to Hertzie's dredging up of that uncomfortable incident, seeing as how I will be speaking about Brisk. It is true that Menachem Begin's father was barred from entering the great synagogue of Brisk to deliver a eulogy for Theodor Herzl. And it is true that he broke down the door. But I would just like to add to that two brief points. First, when I was in the Begin Center, the Begin Heritage Center, where there is a little shul, I kicked down the door there in response. And second, in all seriousness, Begin, in a reminiscence of Brisk, which will actually impact my remarks today, did remember the pride they felt in having the rabbis that they had. He said that every member of the Brisk Jewish community considered themselves shutafim l'Reb Chaim Kel l'Reb Yasha Ber, partners of Reb Chaim and his father. Ki'ilu hayinu imam kol yemei chayim, as if we were there with them all of their lives. And so there were moments of tension, but the kesher was always there, as it is today, of course, which is what makes your gift to me today so much more meaningful. I too want to recognize the presence of Bernard Haston and to express my deep, deep gratitude to his father Hart for Hart's own loyalty to Menachem Begin and friendship to Begin, which was such a boon to Begin, and for allowing me to see Begin through his eyes. Hart was one of the people who actually predicted that Menachem Begin would become prime minister. And by one of the people, I mean the only person who foresaw it prophetically when few others did. And now, thank goodness, what Hart foresaw actually came to pass. And it's wonderful to welcome Bernard who grew up with heart in Indiana, but since then made Aliyah to Chicago, Illinois, my hometown. And it's good to welcome you here in New York, and hope to see you in Chicago, Emir Hashem at Wrigley Field, together very, very, very soon. One other mention and welcome, another figure who has helped the entire Jewish world appreciate Begin's legacy is the late Ambassador Yehuda Avner, and we're so delighted to welcome Yehuda Avner's daughter and son-in-law, my dear friends Debbie and David Sable, who are here with us this evening. In 1958, a volume was published in Israel which was titled Brisk Dilita, Encyclopedia Shel Goliot, the Encyclopedia of the Diaspora, Brisk of Lithuania. The work contained testimonials from Jews who had grown up in the city of Brisk, or in Russian, Brest-Litovsk, the city whose Jews were led for so many years by the Soloveichik family. Very few Jews of Brisk survived the Nazi hordes, and so every essay was a precious testimony to a lost world. One contributor to this volume, to this encyclopedia, was the then leader of a small opposition party in the Knesset in the 1950s by the name of Menachem Begin. And he wrote in his essay as follows: I have asked myself more than once if it would be possible to travel to Brisk. Would I get up and go back to the city in which I spent my childhood? And he answers, no, I will not allow myself to go back to Brisk, yet Brisk will always follow me and be with me. Because, he continued, the three main things I have learned were instilled in me in sorrow and also in joy that I have carried with me from my childhood home, with me during the nights of conflict and the days of joy. Here they are. 1, love your fellow Jew. 2, do not fear the Gentiles. 3, fortunate is the man who carries the yoke of his childhood with him. This is Begin. And it struck me, reading this, that these 3 lessons learned in Brisk encompassed Begin's entire career. First, love your fellow Jews. This was, of course, the man who, as Senator Lieberman wonderfully mentioned, the man who, in the greatest moment of his life in 1948, stood on the Altalena as Ben-Gurion's forces were shooting at him and declared, Milchemet Achim li'olam lo, never a battle between brothers. Love for his fellow Jews motivated every leadership decision that he made. And this was perhaps most humorously illustrated when Begin first arrived in America as prime minister, preparing to negotiate with Carter, and his friends here in the States bought him some new suits because he had been wearing the same suit, I think, for like 40 years and couldn't wear that shmata to the White House as beautifully as he wore it in the spirit of Hadar, of Beitar and Jabotinsky. It's a 40-year-old suit. And so his wife Eliza complained as he's being fitted. She said, I dress you for 40 years, and now you're prime minister, you come to America, and you need a fancy suit. And Begin replies, Alizenke, if it's good for the Jewish people, why do you care? And when the now sartorially splendid Begin met with Carter, he instantiated his second rule: do not fear the Gentiles. When he was told by Carter that he faced Israel's last chance to make peace, Begin replied, our people lived thousands of years before Camp David and will live thousands of years after Camp David. There are no last chances, Begin said, in the lives of the Jews. So do not fear the Gentiles. But most of all, it was the third Brisker lesson that Begin made manifest throughout his life. Fortunate is the man who carries the yoke of his childhood with him. It is this connection to the immortal, ever-present past a bond forged in Brisk that made Begin so different from many of his contemporaries. As Daniel Gordis has noted, for all of Ben-Gurion's love of the Hebrew Bible, Ben-Gurion felt no particular warmth for the Jewish world that had unfolded for the 2,000 years between the Tanakh and the Palmach. But Begin, he continued, could not have been more different. He rejected Jewish impotence no less forcefully than Ben-Gurion did, but like the Sephardic Jews and religious Zionists who would one day form the backbone of his political party, Begin could not imagine and would never accept a narrative in which all that Jewish Europe and the Sephardic diaspora had accomplished was derided. He was no less committed to the Jewish future, but for him, the past animated the future. And therefore, as Gordis notes, he never changed his name, unlike every other founding father of Israel. He kept his parents' name, and when sitting before a Knesset commission near the end of his life and asked his name for the record, he stated, and he simply stated, Menachem ben Dov v'Chasia Begin. As it happens, Begin would not return to Brisk, but I just have. A dear friend, knowing my family history and what Begin means to me, arranged for my family and our friends to journey to Brisk, which is now in Belarus. I will discuss more about this trip and its lessons in the forthcoming issue of Commentary magazine, but I'd like to focus tonight on a small insight on that trip, which led for me to a greater insight, a greater understanding of Begin's great maxim: fortunate is the man who carries the yoke of his childhood with him. By happenstance or serendipity, right before we left for Brisk, the New York Times published a story describing how just this year in Brisk, or now known as Brest, construction workers who were preparing the foundations for a new luxury building uncovered over 1,200 skeletons, the remains of Jews from Brisk murdered by the Nazis. Read the story, boarded a plane, came to Brisk. When we arrived there, the Chabad rabbi, who is now in Brisk, took us to the large pit, the construction site, where the bodies had been discovered. Among the remains was a skeleton of a woman, a mother, her arms clasped around her baby. So what we were looking at, the bones had been removed, and we see the pit. We were looking at the valley of the shadow of death. One member of our group suggested that we say a chapter of Tehillim, we say a psalm, and one sprang immediately to mind. And so we sang, Al Naharot Bavel, Sham Yashavnu Gam Bachinu B'Zachrenu Et Zion. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat, yea, we wept as we remembered Zion. Im eshkachech Yerushalayim tishkach yemini. Al Naharot Bavel, by the rivers of exile. It is, I think, an apt psalm to say, because Brisk is built on the river Bug, and Menachem Begin himself recounted what occurred at that river when the Nazis arrived. Quote, 500 Jews were led one day to the banks of the Bug River near Brisk, Ir va'em b'Yisrael. My father was among them. He started to sing the song of faith on the way, Ani mamin b'emunah shlema b'viat HaMashiach. He also, this is Begin's father, he also called on the others to sing Hatikva. Everybody sang, said Begin. The Germans pushed them into the river and opened fire on them. The Bug River reddened from the blood of Jews. My father and teacher, my elderly father, said Begin, was with them. And then Begin adds two words, Oya li, woe to me. These words, of course, come from the Kinot of Tisha B'Av. And it was in pondering this psalm that one verse stood out, the verse that describes Tisha B'Av. Zechor Hashem livnei Adom et Yom Yerushalayim ha'omrim aru aru ad ha'yesod ba. Remember, God, the day of Yerushalayim, Yom Yerushalayim, when the sons of Edom proclaimed, destroy it to its very foundations. This means in the Tanakh, the phrase Yom Yerushalayim, the words Yom Yerushalayim, described the day that Yerushalayim was destroyed. It described Tisha B'Av. For thousands of years, the words Yom Yerushalayim referred to the day Yerushalayim was destroyed. Now, of course, for the past 50 years, the words Yom Yerushalayim refer to the day, as several Parshanim, modern commentators have noted. Now it refers to the day when Yerushalayim began to be rebuilt. The meaning of the name Yom Yerushalayim has come to be entirely reversed. And this may seem strange, but it's actually appropriate, in fact profound. And it is Begin's connection to Brisk that allows us to understand why this is so. It's well known to anyone who knew Begin how fiercely the memory of Yerushalayim, the Yerushalayim that once was, lived in Begin's heart and soul. And those who did not know Begin well were destined to learn this about him. Thus, Yehuda Avner describes a speech given to Jewish Americans by Begin after Israel was criticized by the UN for declaring the United Jerusalem to be its capital. Chutzpah, said Begin, by what right does the United Nations dare to tell us where the capital of Israel should be? Did the founders of the proud American nation ever ask anybody's permission before they designated Washington as their capital? Just as the builders of Washington, said Begin, endowed their capital city with the letters D.C., so did the builders of Jerusalem endow our capital with the letters D.C., David City. And when, a few days later, Begin read that Lord Carrington, the British foreign minister, criticized Israel's annexation of Jerusalem, Begin, writes Avner, said to him, Hast du gehört das am Meise? Did you ever hear such a thing? Lord Carrington has the chutzpah to tell me what I should be doing here in my own capital. I shall write him a letter. And then he actually writes this letter to the foreign minister, which says, open your Bible, Lord Carrington, and read the first book of Kings, chapter 2, verse 11, where you will find that King David moved his capital to Jerusalem, where he ruled for 33 years, and this at a time when the civilized world had never heard of London, end quote. This was Begin. But few fully appreciate where the critical experiences took place that formed the living notion of Yerushalayim in Begin's heart. The source of this is a building in Brisk, and we were just there. It is that Beit Knesset. Only a few minutes walk away from where these bones were found is a modern movie theater filled now with Belarusians catching a flick. But if you ignore the outer sheen of modern glass and you go downstairs as we did, near the bathrooms, you will see the original stone walls of what once was the great choral synagogue of Brisk, the Beit Knesset of my great-great-grandfather. And this was the Beit Knesset where Zev Begin brought his little boy Menachem to pray, an experience that the boy never forgot. In a eulogy in 1972, on the 30th anniversary of the annihilation of the Jews of Brisk, Begin spoke about this synagogue. He described a school chum of his named Berela Prager, son of the town Shochet, to whom he would bring his family's kaparot. The Shochet's son Berela sang in the choir of the great synagogue with an angelic voice. And Begin said, Hayalo kol hakarui alt. He had a voice that was called alto. Omnam kol shel zamir shamano. We heard the voice of a nightingale. Ubetfilat hamusaf shel Rosh Hashanah shar Berela solo. On Rosh Hashanah, Berela sang a solo, and the verses he sang solo from the Musaf that Begin remembered is the verse that more than any other in the Tanakh must have captured for the mothers of Brisk what it meant to hold their babies in their arms at any time, but especially when their lives were cruelly taken from them. Berela sang, Haben yakir li Ephraim im yeled sha'ashuim, ki midei dabri bo zochor es karenu od. Ad hayom, until this day, Begin said, Ani shomea et kol hatfilah shelo, o et tfilat kolo. I remember even now, said Begin, the voice of his prayer, and I remember as well the prayer of his voice. And then Begin said the following about this Beit Knesset, about the walls, and about those within it. Uvitzaharei Yom HaKippurim, lo rabim bod nisharu betoch kotlei Beit HaKnesset. In Yom Kippur afternoon, not many people are still inside the walls of the shul. Aval eila shenisharu oskim ba'avodah. Those who are there are engaged in the avodah, in the recreation of the temple service in Yerushalayim on this most sacred day. ואבא תובע במפקיע שדווקא בעבודה יש להישאר ולהתפלל כי אולי זוהי הקדושה בכל התפילות של הקדוש בכל ימות השנה. My father, says Begin, insisted that I stay when others leave because he told me this was the holiest prayer of the holiest time of the year. וקולו של החזן מסתלסל יחד עם השוררים, and I heard the chazan's voice blending in harmony with the choir. והכהנים והעם העומדים בעזרה. The Kohanim and the people of Israel standing in the courtyard of the Beit HaMikdash. שהיו שומעים את השם הנכבד והנורא מפורש יוצא מפי כהן גדול בקדושה וטהרה. היו קוראים ומשתחווים ונופלים על פניהם ואומרים ברוך שם כבוד מלכותו לעולם ועד. Berela sang those words, Begin recalled, and those assembled sang it, and he himself sang it. They all sang it, he said, in brisk, ki'ilu hitmol shilshom, as if the avodah of the Beit HaMikdash just happened yesterday. Herein lies the secret of how Yerushalayim lived in Begin's heart and how it lives in the heart of us all. Another boy of brisk, Rabbi Joseph Soloveichik, my great uncle, once commented in Yiddish that ob der Churban Beis HaMikdash hat nicht vernichtet das Yiddische Volk, if the destruction of the temple did not destroy the Jewish people, it was due to the fact that over the temple, the Beit HaMikdash, that they built and preserved in their hearts, over this emotional edifice, haben Nebuchadnezzar und Titus mit alle seire chayolos kan shlita nicht. Over this building, the Beit HaMikdash, in their hearts, Nebuchadnezzar and Titus had no power to destroy. If Jews remained existentially linked to Eretz Israel, it was because of Jews who gathered in locations such as the great synagogue of Brisk on that sacred day, preserving in their hearts and in their souls the image of V'akohanim v'a'am homdim ba'azara, ki'ilu hitmol shilshom, as if it was yesterday. Begin himself commented that Brisk nachon misham banu, from Brisk we came, aval noladnu b'Yerushalayim, but we were spiritually born in Jerusalem. Or to put it slightly differently, it was because Begin was raised in Brisk that he was born in Yerushalayim, because in that Beit Knesset were to be found Jews who were fathers and mothers, sons and daughters, sisters and brothers, who stood together with their feet in Brisk, but their souls in Yerushalayim, singing with loyalty and longing, V'akohanim v'a'am ha'omdim ba'azara. And standing among them, looking upon his father with so much love, praying with so much devotion, remembering a Jerusalem that once was and would be again, was a little boy who would one day lead his people and who would never forget where he once stood, and who would remind his countrymen again and again that honoring Zionism and its achievements means honoring those that he had loved and lost, because fortunate is he who carries the yoke of his childhood with him. What this means is that in the very process of longing for Yerushalayim, it is kept alive in our hearts. Yes, Yerushalayim has now been returned to our people, but it was our ancestors in Brisk and so many other places around the world who kept Yerushalayim alive in our souls until it could be built again. And this is the significance of the psalm we sang for the bones of Brisk, why the word Yom Yerushalayim refers both to Yerushalayim's destruction and now today its redemption. We were enjoined to remember Zechor Hashem et Yom Yerushalayim. We remember the Yerushalayim that was destroyed, and today we celebrate Yom Yerushalayim. The two are linked. The first Yom Yerushalayim led to the second. A refusal to forget the Yerushalayim that was allowed us to return and rebuild Yerushalayim today. The remembrance of Yerushalayim that was led to the Yerushalayim that is, and the Yerushalayim that is yet to be. Begin, in his eulogy for his own family and hometown, put it this way: Niskor et avatam kasher zachinu l'shichrur Eretz Israel v'legulati Yerushalayim. We remember our ancestors' love as we have merited today the freedom of the land of Israel and the redemption of Jerusalem. And then he says the following: V'akohanim v'ha'am ha'omdim ba'azara. Ze beruchenu hodot la'avotenu. This is in our spirits, gratitude to our forefathers. Hodot la'avatam et Eretz Israel. Gratitude to their love of Israel. Hodot l'tfilotehem, gratitude for their prayers. Hodot bitchonam b'viat HaMashiach, gratitude for their faith in the Messiah. Af al pi sheyitmamea im kol zeh b'chol yom achake lo sheyavo. Hem lo zachu, they did not merit. B'neihem achareihem et atchalta dugula kofshu. But their children after them captured the dawn of our deliverance. V'kach ba'avat Yisrael, and thus with love of Israel, ba'avat Eretz Yisrael v'Yerushalayim, nikadesh afaram ha'mefuzar, we shall sanctify their scattered ashes. Na'alet nishmotehem b'ktusha v'tara, raise their souls with sanctity and purity. V'nasi b'libotenu et zecher avatam midor ledor, and carry in our hearts the memory of their love from generation to generation. This week, or this month, the Israeli delegation to the United Nations marks the 40th anniversary of the Israel-Egypt Peace Treaty, negotiated and signed on behalf of Israel by a prime minister who may have acquired new suits in America, but who still retained the old perspective of Brisk. Love your fellow Jews. Do not fear the Gentiles. And fortunate is the man who bears the yoke of his childhood with him. In preparation for that major moment at the White House, Begin wrote out his own draft of his remarks, and he gave it to Yehuda Avner and asked Avner, as Begin put it, to Shakespeareize his remarks. Avner then fancied it up, put it in his own language, and then he left the final printed draft for Begin in his hotel suite. Suddenly, Avner recounts, hardly had I picked up, he said, all of a sudden, he writes, Ovad, a member of the Prime Minister's security detail, accosted me, telling me that Begin was searching for me urgently. He dialed a classified number and put me through. Mr. Begin, you're looking for me, I panted. Yes, where's my speech? So Avner says, on the desk by the window in your suite where you told me to put it. No, said Begin, not that one, my original. It's in my pocket, said Avner. Do you need it? Yes, immediately. So Avner says, when are you leaving for the White House? Says Begin, at 12:40. Writes Avner, I looked at my watch. The dial said 12:20. A shiver ran down my spine. I'll bring it over right away, I said, not having the slightest idea how. By then I spied Secretary of State Cyrus Vance casually chatting with an Egyptian, and in desperation brandished the speech in his face and said with deadly seriousness, Mr. Secretary, unless I get this document to Mr. Begin at the Hilton Hotel within 10 minutes, there will be no signing ceremony today. He stared at me, writes Avner, in disbelief. Come with me, he snapped, and he strode to the front door where he collared a senior police officer who ran down the steps to a waiting police car and ordered the cop inside, get this man to the Hilton. Siren blaring, we hit 80 kilometers an hour within a block, whereupon the policeman extended a massive paw and said, Shalom Aleichem. I am A.B. Feingold, one of the Jewish cops on the Washington police force. This chapter, by the way, in Avner's memoir is titled A.B. Feingold Saves the Peace Treaty. Avner recounts, quote, I ran into the lobby just as Mr. and Mrs. Begin were exiting an elevator surrounded by a bevy of bodyguards. Baruch Hashem, cried Begin. I'll just note that Begin was the only Israeli prime minister who said Baruch Hashem all the time. Baruch Hashem, cried Begin as I handed him the pages. Thank God you caught me. So Avner says, the speech I left on your desk, meaning the Shakespeareized speech, it's not what you wanted? I asked, somewhat peeved. You weren't happy with my changes? Oh no, they're fine, he assured me. It's just that I was going over the typed text, I suddenly had the feeling that today of all days, I want to read my own speech exactly as I wrote in my own hand. And, writes Avner, to make the implicit explicit, Begin added, I wrote it from the heart, and I want to read it from the heart. So Avner informs us. And I am convinced that when Begin spoke of words from the heart, he referred especially to the end of his speech, where Begin, in an extraordinary moment, and Hart Haston was there, he showed me he'd gotten signatures from everyone on the program. Maybe at the next event I can have that as my present. What do you think? Okay. We'll work on it. Okay. So Avner informs us. And I am convinced that when Begin spoke of words from the heart, he referred especially to the end of his speech, where Begin, in an extraordinary moment, said the following. This is the proper place and the appropriate time to bring back to memory the song and the prayer of thanksgiving I learned as a child in the home of my father and mother that doesn't exist anymore because they were among the 6 million people, men, women, and children, who sanctified the Lord's name with their sacred blood, which reddened the rivers of Europe from the Rhine to the Danube, from the Bug to the Volga, only because they were born Jews and because they didn't have a country of their own, nor a valiant Jewish army to defend them, and because nobody came to their rescue, although they cried out, save us, de profundis, from the depths of the pit and agony. That, said Begin, meaning what he's about to read, is the Shir HaMa'alot, the Song of Degrees, written 2 millennia and 500 years ago when our forefathers returned from their exile to Jerusalem, to Zion. Then Begin took out a kippah, placed it on his head, and read the song and the prayer of thanksgiving that, as he himself related, he had learned in the home of his father and mother. Shir HaMa'alot, B'shuv Hashem et Shivat Zion, Hayinu Kicholmim. For Jews in the audience and around the world, it was a moment that remained in their own hearts and souls for many years to come. Menachem Begin was named Menachem because he was born after Tisha B'Av, on Shabbat Nachamu, the Shabbat of consolation. And it is a name and a birthday that is apt, for his legacy involves the linking of the destruction that was and the redemption that is and is yet to be. There was once among many Jews a prominent tradition to begin Birkat HaMazon during the week with the psalm Al Naharot Bavel, and then on Shabbat replace it with Shir HaMa'alot B'Shum Hashem Shivat Zion, as many say today, thereby linking the mourning and remembrance of Jerusalem that was with the Zion that was yet to be. And now suddenly, in 1979 in Washington, the Prime Minister named Menachem for Menachem Av, at the summit of his career, remembers in this psalm his own parents and those of so many others, and children named Berle, and mothers who clutched their Ephraims to themselves, Jews whose blood ran throughout the Naharot Bavel, the rivers of the Diaspora, from the Rhine to the Danube, from the Bug to the Volga. And then, standing before the world in the White House, he makes it known that it was because of those Jews' loyalty to Yerushalayim that the Shuv Hashem et Shivat Zion could actually occur in our time. I am overcome thinking about Begin's parents sitting in Brisk with their young child and singing Shir HaMa'alot together. They could never have predicted, but they yet still would have believed, that the song and psalm about Zion that they taught their little boy would be recited before all the world, and that in that moment, many years after they died, their son Menachem would remember his parents, and suddenly at the White House, the murdered martyrs of Brisk would live again. Menachem Begin may not have returned to Brisk, but Brisk always went with him. Now my family has also been to Brisk, and whether or not we return, the Jews of Brisk will go with us, reminding us not only to mourn for what was lost, but also to feel gratitude for how they lived. This was the lesson of the life of my fellow Brisker, Menachem ben Zev v'Chasya Begin, who loved his fellow Jews, who did not fear the Gentiles, and who always bore the yoke of his childhood with him, and became thereby a leader in Israel, the likes of which we may not see again. Thank you very much.